Decades later, Minneapolis residents would still remember the cold December day. Arthur Doc Barker was just a 26-year-old man, but he was already the mastermind of one of the most dangerous crime families in the United States of America. While $200,000 waited behind the thick walls of Third Northwestern National Bank, Doc had a perfect plan in his mind, but everything wouldn't go as expected.
On the morning of December 16, 1932, the freezing cold of Minneapolis had penetrated to my bones. Looking out the window, the gray stone facade of Third Northwestern National Bank appeared like a ghost through the morning mist. I had been planning this moment for 3 weeks. I had recreated every detail, every possibility in my mind, over and over again. Just as my mother Kate had taught me, if you're going to do a job, do it perfectly. At 7 o'clock, I completed my final preparations in the small apartment on Michigan Boulevard. As I put on my gray suit, I looked at myself in the mirror. My face, carrying the harsh lines of my father George, looked extremely calm this morning. Because I, Arthur Doc Barker, wasn't just a robber, I was a strategist. Despite Karpis's raw power, Fred's courage, and Lloyd's madness, I was the brain of our family. Since we moved from Chicago to Minneapolis, I had been watching the wealthy of this city. Third Northwestern National Bank stood on Nicollet Boulevard, considered the heart of the city. The 3-story, magnificent building seemed to challenge me. I had done weeks of research to find out how much money was inside. The bank employees' shifts, security systems, the distance to the police station. I knew everything. At 8 o'clock, I met with Karpis. Alvin Creepy Karpis was my most trusted partner. I had met him on the streets of Chicago, and he had been my closest friend ever since. We had grown up together in the chaos of the Prohibition era. From bootlegging to bank robbery now, we had always stood side by side on our journey. Karpis's cold, calculating gaze gave me confidence. The harsh wind of Minnesota winter was pounding the windows of our car. Sitting inside the stolen Buick, we went over our plan one last time. My brother Fred sat in the back seat, checking the gun in his hand. Fred had that familiar sparkle in his eyes, a mixture of adrenaline and excitement. He was my little brother, but he had a warrior spirit. He had inherited our mother's toughness the most. Our fourth man, Harry Campbell, sat quietly at the wheel. Campbell was an experienced driver from Detroit. I trusted him in escape plans. While his hands were fixed on the steering wheel, his eyes constantly scanned the surroundings through the mirrors. Experience was very important in such jobs, and Campbell's expertise was our assurance. At 9:45, as we approached the time when the bank doors would open, I could feel my heart beat. But this wasn't fear, this was excitement. Growing up on the cold streets of Minneapolis, I used to look at the rich people's banks and dream. Now those dreams were becoming reality. Michigan Boulevard in front of the bank was filled with normal morning traffic. Businessmen were walking hurriedly in their thick coats, their breath disappearing into the air as steam. None of them knew that in a few minutes they would witness the biggest bank robbery in Minneapolis history. At 10 o'clock, we entered the bank. Inside was warm and decorated, with magnificent marble columns. Crystal chandeliers sparkled on the ceiling. Thick carpets absorbed the sound of our footsteps. A true American bank grandeur, a symbol of wealth and power. But today, this power was in our hands. Security guard William Morrison stood by the door. He was an elderly, experienced-looking man. Perhaps he had seen many robberies, but ours would be different. As I approached him, every detail of my plan stood clearly in my mind. 3 people were working in the teller section. Dorothy Hanson looked young and inexperienced. Charles Peterson, on the other hand, was an experienced clerk who had worked at this bank for many years. Bank manager William Weaver's office was to the right of the main hall. Through the glass door, I could see him working at his desk. Karpis made the first move. He waved the gun he pulled from his pocket in front of Dorothy's eyes and drew everyone's attention in the bank. At that moment, time seemed to slow down. The normal morning routine inside the bank was suddenly interrupted. The astonishment, fear, and panic on the customers' faces could be read in their eyes. I headed to Manager Weaver's office. When I opened the door, he was sitting behind his desk, reading the morning newspaper. When his eyes turned to me, he understood the seriousness of the situation. Weaver was a middle-aged, serious-looking man. He had been responsible for this bank's security for years, but today he was helpless. I told Weaver to go to the vault and take out the money. My voice was calm but determined. The composure I had learned from my mother for years was now serving me well. Weaver didn't resist at all. He was a smart man and understood the gravity of the situation. While going to the vault, the bank's interior architecture came alive in my eyes. Thick steel doors, complex lock systems, but none of them could stop us today, because we had the key inside. Weaver himself. Fred was controlling the customers in the main hall. I could hear my brother's voice, harsh but controlled. He was using the toughness he had learned while growing up on the streets of Minneapolis today. The customers, mostly middle-class Americans, didn't know how to deal with this situation. Campbell was waiting outside with the car engine running. Our escape plan was perfect. We would leave the city center and reach our safe house in rural Minnesota. We had planned every detail in advance. When Weaver opened the vault door, the view inside took my breath away. Thousands of dollars stood in neat stacks on the shelves. This money was the savings of Minneapolis's wealthy families. Now it would be ours. This money, the symbol of American capitalism, was changing hands today. While filling the bags with money, my mother's words echoed in my mind. Kate Barker had taught us, this world is unfair. The rich stay rich, the poor stay poor. If the system won't change, we must change it. This wasn't just a robbery, this was our American dream. I could hear Dorothy Hanson crying. The young woman was probably encountering such a situation for the first time in her life. But this was the nature of the business. Sometimes innocent people were also affected. Still, we didn't want to hurt anyone unnecessarily. As the money count was finishing, I realized the total reached $200,000. This was an enormous amount during the Great Depression era, while an average American's annual salary was around $1,500. The amount we seized was equivalent to exactly 133 years of work. With this money, our family could live comfortably for months. We could escape from Minnesota's cold winter to Florida's warmth, establish new lives with new identities. Looking at the stacks of money, my childhood came to mind. I was born in Tulsa, Oklahoma. My father, George Barker, was an oil worker, but he could never earn enough money for his family. My mother, Kate, always needed money while raising us. In those days, we grew up envying the toys of rich children. Now I was holding the money of those rich people in my hands. The stacks of money in the bank's vault weren't just pieces of paper to me. Every banknote was revenge for the poverty we experienced in our childhood. They said everyone born in America had equal chances, but the reality was far from that. For people like us, the only way was to create chances for ourselves. Weaver stood in front of the vault, silently watching me. There was fear in his eyes, but I could also detect a kind of admiration. Perhaps he too saw the injustice of the system. Despite being the manager of one of Minneapolis's biggest banks, his salary didn't even equal 1% of the money we stole today. As I placed the last stack of money into the bag, the silence inside the bank was ringing in my ears. There were only Dorothy's quiet sobs and the sound of Minnesota wind from outside. This silence was one of the most intense moments of my life, because this silence was drawing the line between my past and future. I could hear Fred's voice. He was telling customers to stay calm. There was that familiar authority in my brother's voice. The cowboy games we played together in our childhood had now turned into reality. But this time we weren't the bad guys. We were heroes seeking our own justice. While Karpis was controlling the situation in the main hall, he kept turning his eyes to the door. His mastery of this profession had always impressed me. Since I met him on the streets of Chicago, I had learned a lot from him. Not just robbery techniques, but the art of survival. Just as we were preparing to leave, police sirens were heard from outside. The sound was getting closer, and my heartbeat began to accelerate. But I didn't panic. I was Arthur Doc Barker, and I was prepared for every situation. My plan also included emergency scenarios. I winked at Karpis. He was ready to. As the sound of sirens approached, the atmosphere inside the bank became more tense. More panic began to emerge among the customers. But for us, this was just part of the plan. I had calculated the response time of the Minneapolis Police Department. We had exactly 12 minutes. Our exit went as planned. Campbell had kept the car door open. The engine was running. As I left the bank, I breathed the cold air of Minneapolis into my lungs, the air of freedom. The bank we left behind was now just a building, but it was much more for us. That building was the symbol of our reckoning with the past. Police cars were coming from the other side of the bank. Their blue-red lights were dancing in Minneapolis's gray sky. But we were already in motion. Thanks to Campbell's experience, we were following our escape route through side streets. With each turn, we were getting one step further from the police. While escaping in the car, we passed through the city streets. The big stores on Hennepin Boulevard were looking at us with their magnificent shop windows. These stores were where Minneapolis's wealthy shopped. Now, with the money we stole, we could buy everything in those windows. The frozen surface of the Mississippi River sparkled in the sunlight. This river was the heart of America, and today we had made history on its shore. Looking at the icy waters of the river, Mark Twain's stories came to mind. He too had adventures along this river, but our adventure was much more real. As we headed toward St. Paul, the wind was pounding the sides of our car. Minnesota's winter winds were merciless, but today they were bringing us freedom. Every kilometer brought us one step closer to the safe zone. Karpis, sitting next to me, was checking the money. Every banknote was proof of our victory. As I watched his fingers move among the banknotes, I thought about how this money would change our lives. We no longer needed to do street hustling. It was time to play in the big leagues. Fred, in the back seat, was smiling while adrenaline still flowed through his veins. The expression on my brother's face was shining like when we had accomplished something successful in our childhood. But we weren't children anymore. We were now America's most dangerous criminals. Campbell's experienced hands on the steering wheel were taking us toward our safe house. His background in Detroit was very useful in such situations. He was making every turn, every speed change skillfully. I was seeing the advantage of working with masters of this profession. As we left the city center and headed toward the countryside, the landscape began to change. Minneapolis's dense buildings gave way to farms and icy fields. This rural area meant security for us. Police were very active in cities, but hiding in the countryside was much easier. When we arrived at the safe house, the silence of rural Minnesota greeted us. The small farmhouse looked ordinary from the outside, but inside was our headquarters. Here we made our plans, determined our targets, and took steps on the path to becoming America's most wanted. Inside the house, sitting by the warm fireplace, I relived the day's events in my mind. Every detail, every moment I remembered with crystal clarity. This wasn't just a robbery. This was proof of my mastery. The operations I had been preparing for years, I could now execute perfectly. When we poured the money onto the table, my eyes were dazzled. $200,000 sparkled like gold in the fireplace light. This pile of money wasn't just paper, it was our future. We could escape to Florida, live a luxurious life in Palm Beach. We no longer needed to endure Minnesota's freezing cold. While Karpis was counting the money, there was that familiar gleam of satisfaction in his eyes. Working with him had always been productive. This operation that the two of us completed was a turning point, not just for us, but for the entire Barker family. We would no longer deal with small-scale jobs. Fred, leaning back in the chair across from the fireplace, was smiling with the intoxication of success. This state of my brother took me back to our childhood. When we grew up as children of a poor family in Oklahoma, We couldn't even imagine such a day. Now we had robbed one of America's richest banks. Campbell, looking outside through the window, was checking the surroundings. His cautious attitude came from his experience. He knew that the FBI would now be after us. But this small farmhouse was a safe refuge for now. In rural Minnesota, no one could find us. That evening, while celebrating our success, I had the FBI's reaction in mind. Edgar Hoover's federal agents would now be after us. This robbery would make us nationally famous. Newspapers would write our story. News about us would be made on radios. Throughout the United States of America, people would talk about the Barker family. But I was ready for this war. Even if the FBI had all the technology, all the agents, we were also an experienced family. The toughness my mother Kate taught, my brother's courage, Karpis's intelligence. When all came together, no one could stop us. My mother Kate's proud face could be imagined. The woman nicknamed Bloody Mama would be pleased with her son's success. We weren't just criminals. We were a family trying to survive, living the dark side of the American dream.
The Third Northwestern National Bank robbery was a turning point for the Barker family. Doc's masterpiece plan would take them to the top of the FBI's most wanted list. But every great success has a price, and the Barker family would pay this price heavily. That cold December day in Minneapolis wasn't just a bank robbery, but opened an unforgettable page in America's crime history. Doc Barker's intelligence and family loyalty would make him legendary, while also leading him to his tragic end.